So this is the presentation related to Chapter 6 and Chapter 9. Chapter 6 discusses gender, Chapter 9 discusses sexuality, and there's quite a bit of overlap between these two chapters, and oftentimes, at least in people's minds, conceptually there's an overlap between these two topics. So I'm just going to be doing one video for both of these chapters. And beginning with kind of just an introduction to these terms, and we'll go over all these terms in greater detail. But, you know, sometimes some people use all of these terms as if they were synonyms, as if sex and gender are the same thing, or as if knowing someone's sexual orientation, you know, tells you something about their gender identity or gender expression. And I like to just start off with this little image because hopefully it helps drive home the point that all of these are unique and distinct concepts that come with their own kind of related terminology and verbiage. So we will be discussing all of these terms and concepts throughout this presentation. But if you do find yourself falling into that trap of using them interchangeably or getting confused, this is always just a good slide to print out as a handout as a way of reminding yourself. So, and while we're on things that I suggest that you print out, an even better handout, and this is something that I would provide students when I teach my gender class, and it's used by a lot of nonprofits, and it's the Genderbread Person version 3.3 because they've gone through several versions. But the Genderbread Person tries to break down, once again, the idea that biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression are distinct terms. And although in a lot of us, they might hang together in an expected way, you know, I was born biologically female, my gender expression is pretty feminine, and my gender identity is a woman. But just because, you know, for me personally, you know, all of these kind of concepts kind of correlate together in that expected fashion, that doesn't have to be the case. It isn't inherently so. I could be, I could have, my sex at birth could have been determined as being female, but perhaps my gender identity is a man. Or perhaps my gender identity is a woman, but my gender expression is very masculine, and I present in a very androgynous type of way, even. And so all of those things are just distinct. And none of those things necessarily relate to who you are sexually attracted to or romantically attracted to, which you see down there can range from nobody to women, females, femininity, men, males, masculinity. And we'll talk more about that when we get to sexual orientation. So, you know, I give you two alternatives here for good handouts, and as a way to just kind of to provide a very easy way for you to reference these concepts and their associated terminology. So let's begin with the one that oftentimes people think is the most straightforward. Sex, also referred to as biological sex, also sometimes called, you know, your sex assigned at birth. You know, sex, this is, of course, you know, your biological physical characteristics. It is, you know, your genotype, your XXXY, your genitalia, and then your sex hormones. We think about those three things as being kind of like primary sexual characteristics. And we often talk about sex as if it is a perfect binary, right? You are male-bodied, you have an XY, genitalia-wise, you know, you have testes, you have a penis, you know, your hormones, you know, you have your hormonal makeup that has more testosterone on average than female-bodied individuals. And then females, you know, you have your XX and genitalia, your ovaries, and vagina and fallopian tubes, uterus. And so we often think about that as if those were the only two options. But there are people who are born that deviate from, this kind of shared grouping of qualities. And we refer to those people as being intersex. And it's roughly about 1 out of every 1,500 babies a year. And a good way to kind of remember this in terms of statistical comparisons is there are roughly the same proportion of people who are intersex as the proportion of people in the world who are natural redheads. So, a good way to think about it statistically is if you know a natural redhead or two in your life, then you probably know someone who is intersex. And it's worth noting that, because a person can be intersex because they have deviations away from that binary in regards to their genitalia, or in regards to their chromosomes, or in regards to their hormonal makeup, because there are varied ways to kind of land in this category, people are not necessarily always aware of this condition until, later in life, when they are expected to go through puberty and it doesn't happen, or it happens in an unexpected fashion, or in some cases, for some women, not until much later in life when they're perhaps trying to conceive, they might find out, you actually have undescended testes, right? So I say this to say, while this is a mutation, it is not so unbelievably rare. And the kind of intersex condition has become more discussed in mass media, primary media, pop culture sources. I would say probably in the last 5 to 7 years. One good example of someone who has kind of sparked this discussion is South African track athlete Caster Semenya. She is biologically, she is female and she identifies as a woman, but in terms of her hormonal makeup, she has a condition which is called hyperandrogenism. And so she has much more testosterone, free testosterone, than what is expected in a woman. And this is naturally occurring. So if you just saw like her hormonal, if you just saw her labs, then you would think maybe that you were looking at a man, based on the percentages and the proportions of the different sex hormones that circulate naturally in her body, and why she's been in the news in for the last 2 Olympic cycles is because there is a controversy over allowing her to compete, and compete as a woman, what to do about her naturally high testosterone. This has been a debate, it's been a controversy. Literally, like just within the last month, the Olympic board decided that she can only compete as a woman if she actually takes hormones to, suppress her naturally occurring testosterone. So they're basically requiring her to drug herself in order to compete, which is kind of crazy if you think about the fact that normally the issue in Olympics is people are taking drugs, and they're basically saying she cannot compete as she naturally is. She will have to take drugs if she wants to compete. And so, and that's just one case. Other things that have kind of come up around the intersex condition is, there used to be a lot of pressure from medical practitioners on parents when their child was born clearly intersex, to make a decision to assign them a sex, and sometimes to even have surgery on, these infants and toddlers, so that their genitalia aligns with their assigned sex. And And once again, that they were, in some cases, given hormones and other drugs. And of course, this was kind of considered standard practice well into the 90s and the early aughts. There's now been a move away from that. There's an acknowledgement, that even newborns and infants have bodily autonomy, especially when you're talking about something like a person's sex, because as we're about to talk about in a moment, because we kind of correlate sex and gender identity, it's not just that you make a decision about what sex to assign your infant, but then raise that child with a specific gender identity in most cases. And plenty of intersex individuals as adults now say that that's the type of decision that should be left up to them. What identity do they want to claim, including the possibility that they might just want to claim intersex. And intersex has been added as an option to birth records and medical forms in several states, and it is the norm in some countries. Because once again, before I leave this behind, I just want to emphasize, 1 out of 1,500 babies a year. While it's not extremely common, it's also not extremely rare. So we are actually talking about a lot of human lives here. So that's sex. And so, we differ along those sexual traits, genitalia, chromosomes, hormonal makeup. But if you really think about male and female bodied individuals, on average, we are not dramatically different, especially compared to other animals in the animal kingdom, like lions and peacocks and mallard ducks and orangutans and bull seals. We are not as dramatically different from each other, males and females, as these other animals are. And so the term for that is sexual dimorphism. How different, what are the physical, what is the level of physical difference that exists between the male and the female of this species? And so humans have what we identify as being a very low level of sexual dimorphism. We are much more similar than we are different. And I'll come back to this point in a couple of slides. So what gender? Now, what is it? Well, gender is a social construction that is built around the binary of sex. So we take that sexual binary that you're male or female, and then as a society, as a culture, we build around that expectations in regards to behavior, in regards to roles, in regards to looks, for males and females. And so this is kind of the social constructed aspect of these concepts. So if biological sex is physical, biological, gender is social or cultural. And so, gender can be thought of as having two components. There is gender identity, what you think of yourself as being, who do you identify as? And if the terms that we relate to sex are male and female, and to a lesser extent intersex, then the identity terms, gender identity terms, of course, the most common one is man and woman. In the same way that we've had increased recognition around intersex individuals, our increased recognition around people who reject that binary, right, has led to a creation of differing terms. So probably the most commonly known is transgender. And transgender people who are trans are people who the gender they identify with, who they perceive themselves to be, is not aligned with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And so a term that has since come in more popular use as we become more aware and open of the transgender population is cisgender, because now when we say cisgender man, cisgender woman, or transgender man, transgender woman, a cisgender man or woman is a person who their gender identity, who they perceive themselves to be, aligns with the biological sex that they were assigned at birth. And so those tend to be the most common terms. But then there is a whole host of contemporary terms, some that relate to identity, some that relate to gender expression. So, you have gender fluid, the idea that your expression as well as possible identity is fluid, that you can identify as a man in some and express yourself as more masculine in some context, identify as a woman and express yourself as more feminine in other contexts. Bigender, you equally identify as both. Agender, you reject the concept of gender totally, and do not perceive yourself as having a gender and do not claim a gender identity. Androgynous is usually used in regards to gender expression, that you present yourself as a kind of in a gender neutral, not overtly feminine, not overtly masculine fashion. All of these terms, and that's just a few, right? Because you can see from that like little shot of terms that Facebook offers for people to identify as, gender variant, gender questioning, gender queer, bi gender, which I talked about, gender nonconforming, which is a rejection of the gender binary, is another way of rejecting just the binary terms in general. All of those terms, though, contradict this idea that there's just this gender binary, that you're either a man or you're either a woman. And for a very long period of time, that has been the dominant ideology, the dominant way of thinking about gender in the United States. And before I talk about gender expression, I just want to go to my next slide, because although you are not going to be required to memorize this, I don't even make my gender class memorize this. The takeaway here is that when you start looking at societies that are not, what we would call, Western educated, industrialized, rich societies, when you start looking at other societies that did not have an early influence from, Western religion, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in particular, you will see that the gender binary has never really been the predominant ideology in all of these other cultures, right? We sometimes think about these kind of new identity terms as being some new phenomena in the United States. And it is true. It is a newer phenomenon in the United States. But the idea that people identify outside of just man and woman, we can find so many examples of that in other cultures, in Indian cultures, and Polynesian cultures, in Indian and Bangladesh cultures, in Mexico and Brazil, in New Guinea and Zambia, in the Dominican Republic and Afghanistan, Albania. This is just a subsample of all the ways in which other societies, when they are not kind of based around this Judeo-Christian tradition, and I emphasize that just to say, when you have a country that's built around that religion, I mean, that starts off with the, in the beginning, and God created two people and they were Adam and Eve. Of course, the society that comes out of that belief system is going to embrace this strict gender binary. But if you can imagine a society that doesn't start off with that story, you can maybe see that people in other cultures, in other time periods, have been much more expansive. and these are just some photos to align with some of those identities that were mentioned there from those other cultures. But if we go back, you know, I just like to emphasize that, you know, the gender binary, because it is socially constructed, that does mean other societies can construct their own definitions and their own gender systems. And the ones that those societies have constructed have not always been limited to two. But in the United States, especially, you know, before a good 10, 15 years ago, it really was a very strict binary. And so you had, you know, you had your biological sex, male, female, and it was supposed to align with how you saw yourself in terms of the socially available definitions. You know, you were a man or you were a woman. And then the second part of the gender concept is gender expression. You know, how are you supposed to act? How are you supposed to express and present yourself? And the terms that we associate there, once again, used to be along, you know, a perfect binary. You were masculine and you were feminine. Men were masculine, women were feminine. And what this meant in terms of looks would be, you know, men have short hair and women have long hair. What it meant in terms of dress, you know, women wear dresses and skirts and men wear pants. You know, women wear makeup and men do not. In terms of behavior, women are nurturing, they're kind, they're gentle, they're responsible. Yeah, they're sweet and good natured. Yeah, I feel like I'm reciting that old nursery rhyme, what are little girls made of? But anyway, you know, that was kind of the expectation for femininity. And what about masculinity? Well, you know, men are strong, men are brave, men are aggressive, men are the leader, they're the head of the household, they're stoic, men don't cry, right? Everything that I just said, all of those are our gender norms, our expectations for behavior, how we expect the genders to express themselves. And then we label that as being masculine or feminine. And so I'm still just going in the wrong way. And like I said, that kind of idea that this is a perfect binary, it existed in America for a very long time. Obviously, there were always people who subtly, covertly pushed back against that binary, but there weren't a lot of spaces and opportunities for people to really push back and complicate the binary and say, you know, this doesn't fit me, this isn't who I am. And for a very long time, and you know, we didn't give people the space to do that. There were safety concerns around, you know, what would happen if you do that. But at some point that changed. And, you know, and Laverne Cox, who some of you may recognize if you watched Orange is the New Black, when she was featured on the front of Time magazine, they referred to her as being the transgender tipping point, or her being a representative of what they call the transgender tipping point. And it was the idea that as we started to have openly transgender individuals, you know, playing themselves, playing roles on TV, telling their stories, right? At society acknowledging that there are individuals who do not fit the binary, who reject the binary, and, you know, and as opposed to keeping them pushed off to the sides and lurking in the shadows, it's like, you know, once we acknowledge that, you know, where do we go from here? What does that mean? And so before I talk a little bit more about, you know, the transgender tipping point and how it has complicated the binary, let me first say that, you know, for some of you, especially some of my older students, you might be tempted to use the term transsexual. And I don't want you to think that that's like a full-blown slur, unlike the word tranny, which is a full-blown slur. Do not use that word. I can tell you do not use it in my class. I would like to tell you do not use it in your life, but I don't have that power. But if you would not use other slurs slurs related to race, or slurs related to, sex, or slurs related to sexual orientation. Please do not use that slur. But transsexual is not so much a slur. It used to be a term that was in that was much more commonly used. That along with the term transvestite, which is also now no longer seen as being acceptable. And part of that is, especially the term transsexual, is it located gender in genitalia. That term transsexual really kind of focused quite a bit on genitalia, the idea that your genitalia did not align with how you were presenting yourself. And there was a lot of fixation, right, on what type of surgeries or how much surgery a person has had. Are they and and that is just not really how we now know gender to be, or how we now think of gender being. Because as I said, gender identity, and if you go back to your little handout with the man, it's pointing at the brain, not at the genitalia. And it's that sense of, once again, who do you think of yourself as being? Who do you perceive yourself as? What identity are you owning? And identity isn't located in the genitalia. So that's why we now, the term transgender has surpassed these other terms. And and the example that I normally give, as a person who identifies as Black, it's not so much that people never should have used the word Negro, but that term of referring to Blacks or African Americans is no longer in favor. It's no longer considered acceptable. Our lexicon has moved on, and that's kind of how you want to think about transsexual, right? The lexicon has moved on. We now use the term transgender. Now, it's worth noting that the term that pops up in the DMS, and it still is in the most recent DMS, which is the diagnostic manual that's used by psychologists and psychiatrists to diagnose and treat people with mental health disorders. They refer to it as gender dysphoria. And there is a lot of pushback from the transgender community and their allies about this medicalization and this kind of negative labeling of their identity, right? It being labeled as being a mental illness. But just know that if you see that term gender dysphoria, right, that is what the condition is referring to. It is taking transgender and medicalizing it into a mental health condition. And in the same way that it's kind of like, it was kind of tacky to focus on, like, what type of genitalia does a person have, right? We don't necessarily find that acceptable to do to cisgender people. It's kind of not cool to do that to transgender people either. But you will oftentimes hear people maybe add that to their identity, or people add that to their label, a fixation on whether or not people have had sex reassignment surgery. And if so, have they had top or bottom or full surgery? And one way that you might see this in readings or articles is they might talk about someone being fully transitioned. Like I said, right, we for the most part don't go around openly speculating on, the size of a guy's penis, or, the wonder about, the width of a woman's areolas. So in the same way, right, just granting people their right to privacy and bodily autonomy, I personally find it a little tacky, when people tack those labels onto transgender individuals. And I know because I've seen enough interviews with transgender activists and actors and actresses that oftentimes when interviewers ask these types of questions, most of them find them rather insulting. So, as I said, the transgender individuals complicated that binary. And then since that tipping point, since our kind of like societal acknowledgement that there are people who are rejecting the binary, probably spurred on by the internet and the ability to connect with like people and quickly introduce an idea or term into kind of our general, cultural vocabulary. Since then we've had a lot of terms that relate to kind of rejecting the binary that people might embrace and identify as being genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, just to name a few. Now, for all of us who are like, I'm still just a cisgender man or woman, and in some cases, maybe you don't even bother to even add the term cisgender in front of it. But for the rest of us, what about us? How do we complicate the binary? It was said for a very long time that men and women are opposites. They're opposite sexes, opposite sexes. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Is that true? Are we really that opposite? I told you that we would come back to that concept of low sexual dimorphism, and here we are. Because when we look at the physical biological evidence, we just aren't. There are some mean level differences, especially with something like height and body hair and breast and musculature. But in all four of those cases, if you're thinking about them as like graphs, there is what we call the law of the excluded middle, that point where the graph overlaps, right? Where the taller women are taller than the shorter men. And I say that as a short woman who has short brothers, and there are plenty of women who are taller than them. And so, it would be that overlap, right? And that's true with things like height. And even something like body hair, because when men go through puberty, a secondary sex characteristic that they develop is post-puberty, because they now have more testosterone, free testosterone in their bodies, as they become hairier. But once again, not all men. There are the ones that grow the luxurious beards, and they're the ones that, can't grow a beard at all. They're the ones that look like they have a rug on their back, and they're the ones whose bodies are like, I don't know, as smooth as a seal. But then maybe more importantly is the fact that women vary in our amount of hairiness, right? We might, a lot of us, present a hairless front, but let's be honest, that's not natural. And that's the point that, that point that's made right there, that this difference isn't rooted in biology as much as behavior. So it's not so much men are hairy and women are smooth. It's, men and women are hairy, although not equally so. Men are usually still on average hairier, but women give the impression of being non-hairy because of what we do. And what do? We wax and we shave and we nair, and we maybe even invest in electrolysis. And we do this day after day, week after week, for some of us from the moment we hit puberty. And so our lack of body hair isn't necessarily rooted in biology, but it's rooted in behavior. Something like breast, once again, on average, women have breast and men don't. But there is a condition where men can develop breast. And maybe more importantly, women's breasts vary dramatically in size. And in a country where a growing number of people are overweight and obese, and breasts are really just fat, a large part, that means that with a growing number of Americans being larger, at least, both men and women have the appearance of breasts due to just increased body mass. Once again, kind of like body hair, for some of the smaller chested women, we give off the impression of being busty with our Wonder bras and Victoria's Secret push-up bras. Breast augmentations have consistently been like in the top 3 most popular surgeries since the 80s. And so, once again, if you're thinking like, well, women have breasts and men don't, there is, while there is that biological difference, it's not as dramatically different as our behaviors then makes it seem. And then, of course, for men who have breasts and do not want to have them, there are smoothing t-shirts, and there are binding products that are meant to reduce the appearance of breast in men. And once again, I'm not talking about transgender men. I'm talking about even cisgender men. Musculature, yes, with the testosterone, as well as just kind of differences in terms of where body fat accumulates. Men are usually more muscular, especially in their upper body, than the average woman. But there are social practices that exacerbate this difference, and they begin very early on in life, right? If in our society, where men are expected to do push-ups on their toes, and girls as young as 5 or 6 are allowed to do push-ups on their knees, and they refer to them as girl push-ups. We and through these social practices, we encourage different level of musculature to be developed between men and women. And it is possible for women to develop more muscular builds. It does require much more work, and probably, and well, no, not even probably, and the most muscular woman is not going to be as muscular as the most muscular man, but the most muscular woman might be much more muscular than a lot of the average men. So once again, it's that law of the of the invisible middle, that overlap. And then finally, reproductive abilities. And this one should seem like a no-brainer, because you're like, well, reproductive abilities, that relates to primary, sexual characteristics, right? It relates to our genitalia. And that's true. A cisgender man cannot carry and give birth to a child, and a cisgender woman can, but not all cisgender women can. And I think that's important, because as we learn more and more about infertility, especially infertility that is considered having no real known reason or cause, it's worth noting when we say, well, a woman can give birth to a child. Yes, women do give birth to children, but not all women are able to give birth to a child. So we don't want that to be the defining characteristic of womanhood, because number one, some women will never give birth by choice. And number two, some women will never give birth because they cannot. Although, once again, it is definitely something that a cisgender man cannot do. So it's just worth noting that, this is what we mean when we say that as humans, we have fairly low sexual dimorphism. I mean, yeah, we're different, but not dramatically so. Not in terms of, our looks, and not in terms of what our bodies can even do outside of reproduction for a lot of women. And so a lot of the differences that we see aren't necessarily related in biology, but they're related in, behavior. And behavior, of course, is culturally taught and socially reinforced. And so that is the dominant sociological position when it comes to gender. To the extent differences exist, the bulk of those differences, caveat, not all, but the bulk of those differences are due more so to society than biology. And we know that gender is socially constructed because, we can just see, we can make several observations. Number one, gender roles vary culture to culture. So what is masculine, what is feminine in one culture might be defined very different in another culture. And so this is from my gender textbook, but just some examples. In our culture, physical touch among men is largely, if they're not family members, is largely frowned upon. Maybe you give a pound, maybe you give a dap, maybe you give a handshake, or, even the half, bro hug. But it mentioned that in several European nations, men kiss. They greet each other by kissing on the cheek. As well as in some cases, it's acceptable to kiss give a light peck on the mouth. In several Arab countries, men hold hands, and this is not meant as a romantic or a sexual gesture. Clothing. In our culture, for the most part, men do not wear skirts, but think about the kilt in Scotland. And then the color pink. It's associated with femininity in our culture, but in other cultures, it's considered to be a gender neutral culture. And then in some cultures, it is even considered to be a masculine color. And it's worth noting historically, as we get to our second kind of observation, that gender rules vary over time. Historically, in European cultures, pink was considered to be a boy color because red was considered to be a manly color, and pink was seen as being a lighter derivative of red. So in the same way that a boy is a child version of a man, pink was seen as being a child version of a manly color. And of course, now that's changed. So, that brings me to the point that gender rules vary over time within a culture. So something like earrings, that we used to associate at some point largely just with pirates. Over time, it became acceptable for women to wear them. And at first, it was largely just a certain class of women who pierced her ears. But then it became kind of a dominant gender expression for femininity. But then sometime or in the 80s, with the rise of hair rock, hair metal, and hip hop, and those types of musical subgenres, earrings began to pop up on the ears of men. And then there became all these complicated rules about, for men, which ear do you pierce? Do you pierce both? And what message does that send? And so now, for the most part, people think very little of seeing men or women, boys or girls, with pierced ears. And then the final point about how gender is clearly a social construction and isn't, a set in stone objective reality is that gender definitions can even vary within a culture at one time. And that's because even though we all share maybe a large general culture, we also have subcultures. We have subcultures based on our racial ethnic groups. In some cases, like if you're Mexican American or Chinese American, we have subcultures based on our religion. Maybe you're Quaker or Mormon or Amish. We have subcultures kind of based on, what we do, what activities we do, skater culture, surfer culture, ranch culture. And in all those different cultures, right, the rules about this is what a man is like in our culture, this is what a woman is like in our culture, that can vary. And so that's even within one culture, there can be these differing kind of concepts of what does it mean to be masculine and what does it mean to be feminine. So all of this is just saying, once again, none of this is natural, right? You're not born as a girl loving the color pink. In the same way that boys aren't born being more aggressive, but how we raise people, the messages that we give them, the behavior that we reinforce versus the behavior that we punish, what we see kind of on, media, the messages that the media espouses. All of this makes us think that these differences are natural, that they're innate, that they're inherent, but that's not necessarily the case. And so the kind of conclusion is that, gender difference does exist, but it is overstated. We talk about men and women as if they're dramatically different, and they're not. They're very, very similar. So why have we consistently overstated the difference between men and women? Well, that has a lot to do with power, right? In order for one group to have more power than the other, they need to be easily distinguishable from that other group, right? You have to make some clear markers and boundaries between different groups, so that you can be clear, which one is the more powerful of the two. And those differences in power over time contribute to societal level inequalities, which we'll talk about. And so, if we're talking about gender, a term that we use is gender stratification, and that's just a term that suggests or states that there's an unequal distribution of wealth, power, and privilege between men and women in society. Stratification, if you can recall from your class chapter and video, is like a ladder. And so gender stratification is a ladder where your position on the ladder is based on your gender. And in a society that has gender stratification, where men are the gender that is on the top rung of the ladder, we refer to this society as a patriarchy. And that is a social pattern in which males dominate females. It literally means rule of the father. And in a true patriarchy, men have all of the power. Not just in their household, but in public spaces as well, from politics to the world of business. If we want to be really accurate, in a society like the United States, where we have what's called formal gender equality, meaning at least according to the law, men and women are supposed to be equal in these spaces, then what we really have is a modified patriarchy, because even though men might still be more powerful in a lot of these contexts, it's no longer solely, it's no longer the law. So it doesn't have to be that way. The fact that it is still that way, says a lot about our ideology and our belief systems, and how changing the law doesn't change a system overnight. And so, just kind of know that, there are places in the world that still have true patriarchies. America is not one of those. It's worth noting that most gender scholars suggest that what we have, and what a lot of first world industrializations have, is a modified patriarchy. But there are other countries, particularly some in Europe, that are much more gender egalitarian. But America is not there yet. And this just kind of shows you, when I say America's not there yet, it just kind of shows you that, although we are a country where women have above average social standing, that there are countries, Canada, our neighbors to the north, a lot of Europe, Australia, where women's social standing is high. And they make that decision by pulling data related to things like income, home ownership, business ownership, political participation, and representation. And so if that raises the question in you, well, why isn't America high? Why are we just above average? Well, I'm about to answer that in our upcoming slides, as we start to talk about what exactly does gender inequality look like in the United States. So before we get into our gender inequality in the US, let's just put the fact out there that gender inequality exists in almost all known societies, past and present. there have been very few, all pretty much none, perfectly gender egalitarian societies. If we go back to early hunting and gathering societies, there were a few matriarchies where lineage was traced through women, and women had a lot more political power and social status in those societies, but they were relatively few in number. So why has that always been the case? That in most societies, when you're talking gender stratification, men have had more than women. And that's because in a lot of societies, most societies, the ability to earn money is associated with power, wealth, and status. And so this has impacted women's social position across time and space. Funny enough, it was those early hunting and gathering societies, even the ones that weren't matriarchies, where women were more equal in power and prestige than a lot of societies that came later. And that's because money didn't exist in those societies. And in terms of just societal contributions, when it comes to something like food, hunting was not consistent. It came with a lot of status, which is why in those societies, men often still had a little more status than women. Being a hunter, came with a little bit more social status, but women kept the tribe from starving. And in some societies, we now know that both men and women participated in both hunting as well as gathering, and so these societies were, believe it or not, a little bit more gender equal. But by the time those societies became more agricultural societies, so they stopped being migratory and became more stable and staying in one spot, and trade and warfare became more central features of social organization, the social standing of women began to fall. And that's because even more so than hunting, trade and warfare, traveling between different societies, going out and fighting in wars, this was much more difficult for women. And that's largely just due to, just the practicality of reproduction. There was no birth control back then. So in a lot of ways, women's lives and were constrained by getting pregnant and having babies and then nursing children. And they nursed for much longer than most mothers nurse nowadays, because that was a way to keep your child fed without taking other food away from adult members of society. So, you could, in a hunting and gathering society, still be a fully contributing member, despite being pregnant, despite having a child or multiple children. But it's much harder to, get status in a society where now, in order to gain that status, you have to be a tradesperson or a soldier. So this is where we truly start to see women losing some status compared to their male counterparts. By the time we get to the industrial society, so now we no longer have the bulk of people working on farms. They're working in cities, they're working in factories, they're working in industries that popped up in cities to cater to the people working in factories. It's interesting because the requirements of physical survival, reproduction, and economic organization should no longer exert those constraints. Meaning, unlike the very real reason why women in agricultural societies could not be soldiers and tradespeople, those reasons and rationales did not have the same logic in industrial societies. However, these societies became even more more gender stratified than the societies that preceded them, as it began to be seen as men and women should have separate spheres. And we developed this whole ideology around men going outside of the home and earning money, and being the head of the household in that way. And women being seen as staying in the home and being takers and being nurturing. And in this separate sphere ideology, it stripped women of a lot of status, not just within their own homes, but obviously within the larger sphere as well. And so, unsurprisingly, as we move into those industrial societies, the role of sexism really started to loom large in a way that it not that it didn't necessarily exist in agricultural societies, because it more than certainly did, but the idea that men are just innately superior to women, that they are biologically predisposed to have these conditions like leadership and aggression and seriousness and non-emotionality, that make them better, better in the world of education, better in the world of business, better in the world of politics. It was that ideology, that sexist ideology, that really kind of allowed for this gender stratification to really solidify during the industrial period. And so that period of time, that was the world that we lived in for a very long period of time. Not until we start to see post World War II some real kind of pushback against this ideology, this separate sphere ideology that kept women out of a lot of public spaces, a lot of colleges, a lot of jobs. And so by the time we get into the 60s and the 70s with the women's movement, this is where women do win through court cases, as well as women are granted through the political process, through laws, rights that they did not have. Before the 70s, women could not have credit cards that they opened themselves in their own names. Women could not rent an apartment or get a mortgage loan on their own. Women could not open a bank account on their own. There were plenty of jobs where, in order for you to have that job, you had to, basically bring a permission letter from your father or your husband. And there were some jobs that just prohibited married women, period, from even holding that job. So, obviously, and that's why I say we don't live in a patriarchy anymore. We live in a modified patriarchy, because I don't want to knock the fact that laws and policies have really done a lot to increase the rights and the opportunities of the average American woman. But what those policies and laws cannot do is necessarily make ideology and beliefs change in people. And and it's probably that kind of persistent ideology, those persistent beliefs that some people have, that men and women are innately different, and for some people that men and women are innately different and men are superior, that leads to the gender stratification that we can see in almost every social institution in the United States. Family life, education, workplace, politics, religious life, mass media, military, crime and violence. You can pretty much see some evidence of gender inequality in all of those. I'm going to highlight a few, just showing you some graphs. Not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I really just do this because for those of you who don't take a gender class with me, and don't want to watch my random gender videos on YouTube, this is just proof that I'm not just, pulling this all out of nowhere. So let's start with like the good news. Gender inequality in the higher education system is probably the one arena in life where we are starting to see the elimination of a lot of inequality. And that is because you can kind of see that beginning in the 70s and 80s, we start to see a flip where instead of men out enrolling women in college, women begin to out enroll men. And this gap has increased. And what you see on that other graph is that this gap between male and female college undergraduates, it exists in pretty much every racial ethnic group. Some groups, the gap is relatively small, like Asian Americans, and some groups, the gap is pretty large, like African Americans. And so this is maybe, a gender success story. If anything, for some higher educational scholars, they're starting to be concerned about, why are men rejecting college? Why are they less likely to enroll? Why are they more likely to quit? Should, we be concerned? And there are growing numbers of grants and programs and resources that are being targeted towards men, keeping men in college, getting men to enroll in college. Where the gap between men and women undergraduates tends to be the least is in STEM fields. So there is still a gender gap where men are more likely to be in STEM than women. And I read an article just the other day. It was very interesting because it was saying that based on high school performance, there are plenty of women based on their high school performance in their science classes and math classes that you think would be in STEM, but they are not as likely to choose STEM majors as men who, based on their high school performance, maybe shouldn't choose STEM majors. And so, once again, that just kind of shows you how it's not even so much about opening up opportunities, but maybe trying to get at some of the beliefs, the internalized beliefs that might be keeping women from enrolling in STEM majors and men from maybe enrolling in college, period. Now, all of those women getting college degrees has contributed also to narrowing of the gender gap in the labor force. As you can see, in the 1890s, most people in the labor force were men. And we see that narrowing over time with a spike during the World War II years where it got increased, where it got briefly closer. And then it kind of, that decrease kind of went away after men came home from the war. But then after that period, especially beginning in the 70s, there's been kind of a dramatic kind of converging between men and women labor force participation. And to go along with that, what about in terms of pay? One thing that comes up quite a bit is the wage gap. And you can see that the wage gap, and it's measuring it income in terms of thousands. It has persisted over time. And at some point in the 80s and 90s, it even got larger than the preceding years. And it has, we still have not perfectly narrowed it. That's what I'm trying to say here. There are different ways to try to statistically control for it, but it's worth noting that even if we can get it, and I think the narrowest they've been able to get it is down to like 91, 92 cents. Basically, if you are a white woman with no children who is past the age of having children with an advanced degree, like they can get you within a couple of cent of a man. But pretty much whether you are comparing within age ranges, whether you're comparing within racial groups, there is this persistent wage gap where men make more. And why that's the case is like a whole separate lecture, which you are welcome to look up if you so choose. You can find the video, one of my past gender videos from my introductory classes, where I talk a little bit more about, is this because of occupational segregation? Is this because of just straight up sexism? Is this because of the motherhood penalty? Is this because of practices related to, promotions and salary negotiations? And the answer is it's a little bit of all of those things. But the kind of key takeaway is even as women have become more educated, and even as they have narrowed the wage gap, they have not been able to make it totally go away. And that's true at every single educational level. What about in the home? Well, the good news is if you're heterosexually partnered with children, your male counterpart is doing more than previous men in past generations. He is not necessarily doing the same amount of household labor as women. There is a lot of different studies that look at how chores are divvied up in married families. And what they consistently find is even when women are working full-time outside of the home, they are more likely to be doing the housework and the caring for household children. That particularly, they're more likely to be doing the housework. And the type of housework that they do, the housework associated with femininity, cooking, washing dishes, washing clothes, ironing, vacuuming, those are the types of tasks that pretty much require you to do them daily. The household tasks that men are more likely to do and report doing, things like mowing the lawn, washing cars, fixing things around the home. Those things are more intermittent and don't necessarily require doing them daily. And so this contributes to inequality in terms of, as this one chart showed, how much leisure time people have, because self-care is important, right? And so politics is another arena where we can see some gender inequality, that, obviously there has yet to be a female president. U.S. Congress is overwhelmingly male. Governors, that's not at parity. None of this is at parity. And I give you this other chart because it's just worth noting that in a country where we have a strong two-party system, and it varies election to election, who has control of the Senate, who has control of the House, but it's just worth noting that there is a huge gap in female politicians who are Democrats, elected female politicians who are Democrats versus elected female politicians who are Republicans. And it's just worth noting that until the Republican Party becomes as likely to support and vote for women as the Democratic Party is, we probably will never reach parity, because all the gains in the world on the Democratic Party are still not going to result in gender parity if Republican women do not run for office and win positions as well. And so politics is still is an area where we still see some pretty extreme stratification, much more so than education and labor force. This is just a chart comparing the political power depending on, what state you're in. And it's just worth noting that, you think about California being really progressive, but, they're actually ranked compared to other states as being below average if you're talking about the legislative seats held by women within the state. Something worth reflecting on. The final kind of bit of gender inequality, I'm going to go over briefly now, but I'm going to talk about it longer later in the presentation, is just in regards to violence. So there is a real gendered aspect of violence in the sense that men are overwhelmingly much more likely to be the perpetrators of violent crime. But they're also more likely to be the victims of violent crime. And that's because the most common form of crime is male on male violence, men perpetuating violence on other men. But then the next most common crime, type of violent crime, is male on female, and it is significantly higher than the converse, which is female on male. And the only thing that's less than female on male is female on female, especially if you're talking about in terms of murder, homicide. And so you can see there, like, women are dramatically overrepresented as victims comparative to killers. You know, they are over twice as likely, you know, to almost 3 times as likely to be victims as they are to be killers. And a lot of this is of course related to these gendered messages that we have around aggression, around anger, you know, who we encourage to you know, to lash out, you know, the idea that certain sports and certain media makes violence acceptable in certain contexts. It's not surprising that a lot of the violence is committed by men, and that's whether you're talking armed robberies and stalking, rape, aggravated assaults. Even if you're talking about in terms of self-harm, that is also committed by men. Firearm suicides, right? Committing suicide with a gun, 87% of those are men. And so we'll come back to this discussion when we talk a little bit more about health here in a second. But just once again, just kind of think about, you know, this isn't biological, this isn't natural. These types of statistics do not exist in every other country. So that's part of how we know that this isn't biological or natural. You can't just blame testosterone, because if it was testosterone, then wouldn't we see these types of statistics, this type of gender divide in terms of violence in all countries? And although it is worth noting that in all countries, men do tend to commit more violent crimes than women, this level of difference, and as well as just the sheer amount of crimes that are committed in America, including some crimes that are seen as being uniquely American, like mass murder, where more than 4 people are killed at one time, you know, it does speak to, you know, the significance of our social constructions around what does it mean to be a man, or to be manly, or to be masculine, and how what we're saying about being a man and being masculine, how if it's taken to the extreme, it can have very negative consequences for men themselves as well as for larger society. And so your book, you know, kind of emphasizes 2 theories, 2 theorists that discuss gender, that kind of shed some light beyond just the definition of gender. The first is Judith Butler, who sees gender as a property, which emerges as we perform our gender according to how gender is scripted by society. So putting that in layman's terms, her point is gender isn't who you are, gender is what you do. And if you do gender consistently enough, and you do it by, you know, constantly upholding, you know, what they say you should do based on, you know, whether or not you are a man or a woman. She was like, that's really what you're doing, more so than having this like real and true gender identity. And so, you know, I like that quote there. I pull that quote there because what she says, we act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. And so her idea that you're only a man or you're only a woman if you're doing gender, if you're consistently doing gender. Otherwise, who would you be? I mean, you'd be an individual, you'd be a human, but you know, you wouldn't necessarily be this socially defined entity called a man or a woman. Now, admittedly, if you hate theory, that might be a little out there and hard to wrap your head around. Don't overthink it, especially for this class. The other theory that your book goes over is Connell's gender hierarchy. And this theory emphasizes that there are power relations inherent with gender, but these power relations don't just exist between men and women. They also exist, between men and other men and women and other women. And so her focus is on there are different forms of masculinities and femininities. I don't know why your book left out marginalized masculinity, but you can see I added it there. And then I could not find a very good graphic that added femininity to the mix, but you really want to think about like that bottom space is being shared by subordinate masculinity as well as all types of femininities. And so I'm going to go to the next couple of slides to kind of provide definitions of all these terms, and then I'll come back to make my final point about Connell. So hegemonic masculinity. This is the dominant model of masculinity in society. It's the one that most people know and are aware of, even if they don't fully agree with it, and even if as men they don't fully uphold it. The hegemonic male ideal, he is strong, he's brave, he's heroic, he's successful in business, he's athletic, he's tough, he can change a tire, he can kill a bug, he can catch a football. He might not be faster than a speeding bullet, but he is all of these icons that you see in front of you. He also, in terms of demographic characteristics, is usually associated with whiteness, upperclassness. In American society, Christianity, he's heterosexual, he's probably tall, he doesn't have a disability, right? He is this ideal, societal ideal. But what about all the other men that do not live up to this dominant form? All right. Well, this is where you get your others. Underneath hegemonic masculinity is what we call complicit masculinity. This is a man who doesn't fit the characteristics of hegemonic masculinity, but doesn't necessarily challenge it. And sometimes he maybe even admires the hegemonic ideal. My example there is Ross Geller, right? So maybe this guy is nerdy. Maybe he's not athletic. Maybe he, is... maybe he isn't as successful, right? Maybe he's not the boss at work. He's just a middle manager, right? But oftentimes the key thing is he doesn't have the type of trait that makes the hegemonic ideal too far out of his reach. So, mixed along with that admiration is oftentimes a certain amount of aspiration. Like, I would like to be this guy, and who knows, maybe someday I will be this guy. And so for that reason, that's why we can even put, like I said, we can even put people that are a little bit, lower class, working class, middle class, in that category. Now, marginalized masculinity is someone who can't fit the hegemonic because of traits that are largely, immutable, traits that they can't change. And so particularly things like race or even like a disability. And so that's why I have LeBron James, because in a lot of ways, like, LeBron James and Tom Brady are like peers and counterparts. And, I put Tom Brady under hegemonic masculinity, but LeBron James' African-American identity does separate him from, Tom Brady in some important ways. If he's just out one day and in a hoodie and sweatpants and someone doesn't recognize him, and he can't necessarily call upon his celebrity or his richness or his athleticism, but instead finds himself being evaluated and judged and perhaps negatively stereotyped due to his Blackness, all those other things don't really matter as much. So that's why and in this case, we're talking about LeBron James. So imagine if we're just talking about, regular man of color. So that's why we consider those people to be, or those men to be, marginalized masculinity. Men with disabilities, they're often placed in this category because they are now seen as being less than, even if this disability was the result of something like serving, in the military or military injury, and they come back and, and people say, thank you for your service. And and that type of thing. But, you know, in terms of how people treat them, how women treat them in the dating market, how people might treat them now that they're back and no longer in the military and needing to get a regular job, you know, it is not there, because their bodies and maybe their minds are now have some sort of disability. They're no longer seen as being this ideal. And finally, we have subordinate masculinity. So these are men who exhibit qualities that are an opposite of those values in hegemonic masculinity, i.e., usually qualities that we associated with women and femininity. And because a key part of hegemonic masculinity is avoiding femininity, for men to be feminine, to be effeminate, they're seen as being the worst form of men, the lesser form of men. So effeminate men, and I use Kurt from Glee, because it's worth noting, it's not just his gayness, it is him being an effeminate gay man that would place him in that role. Now, before we go back to the theory, let's talk about the femininities that your book discusses. What used to be the clear dominant model of femininity was emphasized femininity. She was beautiful, she was sexy, she was nurturing, but she was also nurturing and a homemaker, right? She cared about her appearance and spent a lot of time on it. You know, that was kind of the model of femininity well into the 50s or 60s. And then at some point, that kind of just became the femininity that lives in, you know, media and maybe a lot of heterosexual men's minds, right? They want a Victoria's Secret angel combined with their mama. But a lot of women, they might beat themselves up to a certain extent that they don't look like a Victoria's Secret angel, or they can't, you know, make a pound cake like his mom, but they don't necessarily hold themselves to this standard in the same way that you see a lot of men still holding themselves to the hegemonic male standard. And that's why we call it emphasized femininity, but not hegemonic femininity. There really isn't a hegemonic femininity in today's society. We have broadened and expanded the definition of femininity. What does it mean to be a woman? What is acceptable for a woman? We have broadened and expanded that in a way that we haven't yet done for masculinity. But there are a couple of femininities that your book labels as resistant femininity, and largely resistant to like their place in the patriarchy, or resistant to the fact that they really like they really don't have a place for men, and men don't really have a place for them. And the two examples your book gives are lesbians and spinsters. And what I will say is with lesbians, add lesbians who in terms of their gender expression and you know, the extent to which they are not upholding kind of the beauty standard. Because, you know, lesbians who, you know, look like lesbian porn, they still have a place in the modified patriarchy, in the sense that, you know, a lot of men fantasize about them, find them sexy and appealing, but not your kind of regular lesbians with maybe more masculine gender expression. And then spinsters, of course, at this point is like the assumption kind of being she's old and past her prime in terms of attractiveness, so she's no longer of sexual interest to men. And because she is a spinster and has no husband and has no children, she isn't giving to male society in that way. So going back to the model, you know, you have your hegemonic masculinity, you have your complicit masculinity, you have marginalized masculinity, you have subordinate masculinity. And so you, like I said, besides subordinate masculinity, you can also put the femininities with emphasized femininity being on top of resistant femininity, because there's a little bit more space and opportunity for her in the modified patriarchy. Now, of course, that space might be, you know, being a happy homemaker, being someone's dream girl, someone's sexual fantasy, but there literally is no space in the kind of common you know, imagination of the modified patriarchy for resistant femininity. And before I leave the slide, it's just worth noting, as your book notes, that Connell decouples masculinity from male-bodiedness. And so she gave examples of women who can illustrate hegemonic masculinity. Or to put it more graphically, if you know what BDE stands for, right? There was that whole period where they were talking about that guy on Saturday Night Live, and it was like, oh, he has big dick energy. And I read an article that made the point that, you know, there are women that give off that same energy as well. And if those women find themselves in the top of their field, you know, and find themselves in powerful positions, then at least according to Connell, you know, at that point, they're not doing a version of femininity. They are in fact doing hegemonic masculinity. So going forward. All right, let's now apply this to the study of health. And just a heads up, my voice is giving out. So I think what's probably going to happen is that I am going to turn this into 2 videos after all. I need a little bit of a break. So if we apply this to the study of health, you know, your book makes several points. They don't give you a whole lot of information about gender and health here, but they do make several points. First of all, they say older studies largely focused on women and their health. So when you talked about gender and health, you were largely just kind of conceptualizing it as being women's health. And they said that was largely the case up until the 1990s. So beginning in around the 1960s to the 1990s. So we had 30 years of talking about gender and health, largely from the viewpoint of what does that mean for women. And they said that wasn't necessarily entirely problematic, because women's health and bodies had been historically marginalized and misunderstood and mischaracterized within medicine from the beginning. And if you want a good book to read, one that I was considering for my gender class and ultimately decided not to go with, but perhaps will do in future classes. The book is called Inferior: How Science Got Women Wrong and the New Research That's Rewriting the Story. And so there is a lot in there about, you know, how everything from how heart attacks present in women to, you know, the impact or the side effects of certain pharmaceuticals in women, how none of this was necessarily known, largely just because women were so marginalized in the medical field and in medical studies. But as your book notes, since the 1990s, there has been a lot more focus on men's health, especially kind of understanding the relationship between health and masculinity. And so some important findings that have come out since then is that the demands to live up to the hegemonic masculine ideal lead to real gender differences in terms of risk-taking, so doing stupid stuff that like results in unnecessary risks, you know, stunts that you then post on the internet, or you know, drag racing cars, or not wearing your seatbelt, you know, all of those, that risk taking, much more likely to be done by young men 18 to 25 than young women. Self-care practices, men are less likely to follow healthy diets. They're more likely to smoke. They're more likely to engage in binge drinking. They're less likely to go to the doctor for regular doctor's visits. Choice of dangerous jobs. Men are much more likely to choose jobs that have higher fatality rates than women. And then we've already talked about the violence. And so the consequences of this is that men have a higher mortality rate and they have a lower life expectancy. I think that's my next slide. Bam. Yes, it is. All right. So you can just kind of see that on average, women live a couple of years longer than men. And once again, we can see this across all racial groups where women live longer than men. The mortality rate is higher in men than there is in women. And with some groups like African Americans, this is a much larger gap than with other groups like Asian Pacific Islanders. And although there is some complexity in this, it's not entirely straightforward. And they give the firefighter example, that the social status that comes with being a firefighter kind of allows firefighters to not be to not be judged as being effeminate if they express that they have medical concerns, if they are open and honest about their aches and pains. But they said for a lot of men, if they don't have that type of job, is seen as being masculine, is seen as being tough, to like suck it up, to not go to the doctor, to not talk about it, to not complain. And all of this, of course, just leads to them in on average having shorter lives, and being more likely to die from certainly accidents, but also violence, as well as some chronic diseases. Your book also talks about how there's even a gender difference when men do seek out care in the types of care that they seek out. And they talk about, for like mental health issues, how men, when compared to women, were much more likely to prefer cognitive behavioral therapy versus like talk therapy, because they like the idea of it being steps, and that they had to follow for their treatment, as opposed to just relying on talking. So, besides the fact that men, just don't live as long, there is this saying, women get sicker and men die quicker. And it's the idea that morbidity rates tend to be higher in women, mortality rates tend to be higher in men. And it's a little bit of a paradox. And some people are like, is that a sex effect? Like, is it really a biological difference? Are there biological differences between men and women, where women become sick, they're more likely to get ill, or to profess to being ill, or or is it a gender effect, meaning that because of gender socialization, women feel more comfortable going to the doctor, they feel more comfortable reporting when they're sick, even if it's not a serious illness. And that leads to the question, is some of those morbidity rates because women over-report? But I like to think about it more as, is it really women are over-reporting, or more like men are under-reporting because, like, they've received this message that to be a man is to be tough, and to not have, and to not complain, and not to talk about, when you're not feeling well. And so, that's pretty much it. For gender. Your book makes mention of two other specific international examples that I won't hold you accountable for, but I do encourage you to kind of maybe read a little bit more about them. Particularly the story of the women from Southern Malawi, because it talked about how because these women rely on this kind of fishing industry, they sometimes have to trade their bodies for fish. And what it's led to is a spike in HIV and AIDS rates. And that just emphasizes, kind of the power dynamics that exist, in between the genders, not just in our own society, but in other societies. So I said I was going to come back to gender violence, and here I am. Because although your book doesn't really talk about gender violence as a health issue, they later talk about it in the sexuality chapter, but they talk about it in respect to gender as well as sexuality. So I'm just going to introduce it here. Gender violence is a health issue. And we've already said that, men are more likely to perpetuate violence. But I would like to expand that, our kind of how we think about violence, beyond physical violence, and even sexual violence, to emotional violence, verbal violence, because it is that kind of holistic definition of violence that we use when we are talking about what we call intimate partner violence. And intimate partner violence is what we now call, domestic violence, because the idea with domestic violence is this is a person that you live with. And intimate partner violence is a little bit more broader, because it can be an intimate partner who you don't share a home with. It can be an intimate partner who you used to share a home with. It could be an intimate partner who you have a relationship with because you share children, even though you don't share a home. Intimate partner violence includes people who date, even if they don't cohabit. So it's a broader term. And intimate partner violence is normally seen as being comprised of three types of behavior: physical, sexual, and emotional. Now, what I always, I used to have a job when I left CSUB. I took a job for a year where this is what I did for college, is I was their violence prevention coordinator. And I gave these types of speeches and presentations all the time. And so what I would like to just say from the beginning is that, obviously we don't have great data particular on any of this if the police aren't involved, or if people do not, uh, self-identify as being the victims or perpetrators of these types of violence in surveys and questionnaires. And so because we have this kind of incomplete data, it's just worth noting that when I talk about the prevalence and severity, just know that it's underreported, and particularly for men who are the victims of intimate partner violence at the hands of their partners, whether those partners are male or female. They might be less inclined to report because of the pressures of masculinity, right? The idea that you're letting a woman beat up on you, it goes against that hegemonic masculine ideal. And so maybe a lot of men probably are less likely to report. That being said, especially if you're talking about severe physical violence or sexual violence, at some point, if it is that severe, it becomes out of the hands of the victim because other people witness it or they hear it, or certainly if we're talking about in the case of death, at that point, you no longer have a choice about whether or not you're reporting. And so if we're talking about the type of severe physical violence and reported sexual violence, then it is much more likely to be male perpetuated on their female partners as opposed to female perpetuated on their male partners. We know from the statistics that IPV, that has been reported to the police, has decreased since the 1970s. But that is because the violence committed by women has decreased since the 1970s. And that is because before divorce became more likely, before we had as many resources for women leaving violent situations and needing to go to a shelter, a place to stay, at some point, the women who were with an abusive partner would engage in what is called violent retaliation. And so when we talk about the decrease in IPV rates, a lot of that has been because there has been a decrease in violent retaliation, which you don't have to violently retaliate against your partner necessarily if you have other ways of getting out the situation. And women have had more opportunities, more resources to do that since the 1970s. So, the level of violence that can exist in a violent partnership varies. There are some relationships that we call situational partner violence. These types of violent relationships are normally mutually violent, and the violence is a fairly low level. So this is that couple, they regularly scream at each other, they regularly call each other names. She slaps him, he shakes her, she shoves him, he shoves her back. We don't always necessarily have a lot of good data about this type of violent relationship. We do tend to know that it tends to be more egalitarian. It feels weird to use that word, but so I'm going to use the word mutual. It is a little bit more mutual. They stay in a unhealthy, toxic, violent relationship, but the violence never seems to exacerbate or reach a dangerous level. Intimate terrorism is normally at the hands of one partner. Usually it is the male partner, at least based on the data that we have. The violence escalates. It becomes much more harmful and dangerous and has a much greater likelihood of being deadly and fatal. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that cycle looks like, because when we talk about the cycle, I'll just go ahead and, when we talk about the cycle of abuse, what used to be called the battered women syndrome, that concept comes out of relationships that could be characterized as being intimate terrorism. a new type of intimate partner violence, or new in terms of a more recently labeled phenomena that we are seeing in increasing numbers, is family annihilators. These are people who don't just kill their partner, but they also kill their dependents, their children, and then usually themselves. Every month or so, there is a case that pops up in the media of a family annihilator situation. And although I can, off the top of my head, think of at least two in the last year, 2 years that were perpetuated by women, once again, the vast majority of these are male perpetuators. So going back to the cycle of abuse, what used to be called the battered women syndrome, this was a theory that was created by a psychologist, and it was meant to at the time to provide a defense for women who violently retaliated, right? I talked about that concept, that idea that if you were in a violent relationship, a ongoing relationship characterized by escalating violence, that you felt like you could not escape, that at one point in time, that at some point in time, the women, it usually was the woman, would violently retaliate and kill her abuser. And a lot of these women, and there's actually a great documentary, if anyone's interested, email me because I can't think of it off the top of my head. There's a great documentary about several of these cases in California, because before this kind of conceptual tool was legally recognized, a lot of these women could not claim self-defense. And you'll be able to figure out why after I explain the cycle. So the cycle looks like this. There's a tension building phase. During this phase, it seems like nothing you do can please your partner. They're getting increasingly agitated, increasingly angry. They might go into long spells of giving you the silent treatment or yelling at you, or just, launching intense criticism your way. And the tension builds and builds and builds until there is the explosion phase, also called the acute battering incident. And this is where an attack happens. Usually it is physical, sometimes it is sexual. Although it's called acute battering incident, it's worth noting that sometimes it's actually like a collection of incidents, a constellation of incidents, several incidents at once. But then at some point, your partner cools down, and then they go into what is called the calm or the honeymoon period, where they apologize, they promise that they'll never do it again. They maybe give you gifts, buy you flowers, take you on vacation. Now, the thing about the cycle of abuse is, and you can see there with the arrows, is it repeats itself. And for people who study this, what they've learned is that as you go through, if you are in this type of intimate terrorist relationship, as you go through this cycle again and again and again, the explosion phase gets worse, right? A push becomes an open-handed smack, which becomes a punch, which becomes a full beating. And there's evidence that shows if it ever becomes choking, at that point, the likelihood that your partner will eventually kill you increases exponentially. And at the same time, the explosion phase is getting worse. The honeymoon period gets shorter, and it becomes less characterized by effort. Instead of there being gifts and instead of there being promises, it might even start to segue into blaming, like, why did you make me do that? Or, how I am, you really should know better or do better. And so this happens again and again and again until at some point, the person that is experiencing this abuse might reach their breaking point where they fear for their lives. They decide they can't take it anymore. And the thing is, because of what is usually the difference in size and physical strength, and just brutality between the usually female victim, likely male perpetrator, the violent retaliation doesn't happen mid-beating during the explosion phase. it is most likely to happen during the tension building phase. And then this becomes very problematic, or used to be very problematic from a legal sense, because you really can't claim self-defense if you were not actively in danger at that moment. And oftentimes it wasn't even just that you couldn't claim self-defense, but usually the women would go out and like buy a gun, or have a knife stashed by because they know that it's coming. But then what does that look like in the eyes of the law? Well, now it looks premeditated. And that documentary that I still can't think of off the top of my head, there were a lot of women that were locked up for first-degree murder despite having spouses that had known abusive histories before this became an acceptable defense. And when this was introduced, it was called the battered women syndrome, and it has now been kind of renamed, reconceptualized as the cycle of abuse. And people are like, why do people stay? And it's a very complicated question. There are issues of dependence, both emotional and financial. Oftentimes people still love their abusers. They hope that they'll change. They blame themselves. They've been isolated from, family members and other loved ones. There is evidence that shows that for those who leave, the next year and a half is one of the most dangerous times in their lives, because the likelihood that their abuser will then murder them, violently come after them, increases exponentially. So, this isn't a straightforward situation. And I emphasize it in my health class, not just because of the physical effects of being a victim of this type of abuse, but also just kind of the mental and emotional effects of experiencing this type of violence. And so, the other type of gendered violence that comes up, that is also a health issue, is rape. Rape is a lot more common than we might think it is. Based on our best data, about 18% of women and 1% of men in the United States have been raped at some point in their lives. I put an asterisk beside that 1% of men because it is highly likely that that is underreported. Once again, that hegemonic masculine ideal, a lot of men find it very hard to admit that they have been violated in this type of way, whether as children or as adults. And so they are even less likely to report than women, and they aren't even necessarily very likely to admit it, even in anonymous data collection. So that is a real gap in our data. What we do know about rape for men is that, it is rarer than for women once they reach adulthood. It's most likely to occur pre-puberty. So when they're boys, and it usually happens in the context of family or close family friends, and as opposed to complete strangers or later in life. Later in life, rape becomes much more common for men if they are in prison, so much so that there have been policies passed around rape in prisons. The Prison Rape Elimination Act is meant to address that. What we commonly and culturally, treat as a joke, like don't drop the soap type of thing. This is still violence enacted upon an individual, and that is not the purpose of prison. That is not supposed to be a consequence of prison. You go to prison to serve your time for whatever crime that you committed. The expectation should not be that you are, sexually violated. But for women who are raped, that 18%, once again, in their case as well, these are usually people they know, whether it's an intimate partner or a former intimate partner, whether it's with an acquaintance like a fellow student or someone that they go on a date with, family member. All of those categories of people are more likely to be the perpetrator in a case of rape than a stranger. You know, we're raised to be scared of the stranger in the bushes, and it's not that you shouldn't be scared of the stranger in the bushes, but it's more like the reality is you also have to be scared or at least wary of so many other people. And of course, once again, just like what I said with intimate partner violence, it isn't just the kind of the aspect that this can take on a person's physical health, but also, of course, the impact it can have on their mental health to have to live after having experienced such trauma. And so, you know, this chapter ends with the, you know, the big question of, you know, if we're trying to address some of these health differences that seem to be resulting from gender, and it seems to be a gender effect and not a sex effect, meaning it's because of these socially constructed ideals and norms and expectations related to masculinity in particular, you know, is it more helpful to work with the gender order or to challenge your gender order? And your book doesn't really, you know, it doesn't really answer that question. You know, they give you examples of how different policies, different organizations have done interventions and campaigns that have utilized both approaches, or, you know, and there's been success with doing both. So, you know, that is just kind of a reflective question to consider. And so the thought that I will leave you with before I close out this video, and like I said, I will do a second video for sexual orientation, is this quote from page 106. And this point about how gender impacts health, I think really just sums up the major theme here. And I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to read beginning with as embodied humans, we live in that flux of change and gendered inequality, and it is that which affects our health. So rather than looking for reasons within at the levels of genetics and biology, our attention must be focused externally on how the gender order in the society in which we live constructs gender and the conditions of how we perform gender. So that is what we must address. That is what we must consider if we're going to address some of those health differences that, or, you know, that health disparities that we see emerging out of these gender differences.